The year was 2247 by Earth calendar, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Concord for exactly 30 years. Though most alien species still considered them a minor race unworthy of serious attention, Ambassador Yellen Vasquez stood before the massive holographic display in her office on Unity Station, watching the fleet of Velthran warships moving through the darkness of space toward the human colony world of New Cascadia, and she felt the cold weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. The Velthrans were a reptilian species that had conquered dozens of worlds across 3 centuries, and they believed that their ancient star charts gave them legal claim to any system they desired, including the one where 2 million human colonists had built their homes and raised their children and planted their gardens in alien soil. She had requested a formal arbitration hearing before the Galactic Council just 3 days ago, presenting evidence that humanity had settled New Cascadia legally under Concord law. But the Council had dismissed her arguments with barely concealed boredom. The Velthran Dominion has the superior claim, Councillor Tevan of the Ilisari Collective had announced in his musical voice, his 4 eyes blinking in a pattern that suggested mild annoyance at having his time wasted by such trivial matters. The Velthran High Commander, a massive creature named Kethser, whose scales were the color of dried blood, had laughed at her from across the council chamber with a sound like stones grinding together. "We do not negotiate with prey," he had declared, and the other council members had looked away, as if embarrassed by the humans for even trying to resist. That was how things worked in the galaxy. Yellen had learned, and the strong took what they wanted while the weak either submitted or were destroyed. And everyone simply accepted this as the natural order of things. But Yellen Vasquez was a human being, and her species had a very different understanding of the natural order. She activated her secure communication channel and spoke to Admiral James Chun, commander of the United Earth Defense Fleet, who was waiting aboard his flagship 3 light years away. "They refused arbitration," she said simply. "I expected as much," the Admiral replied, and his voice carried no fear, only a calm and terrible patience that Yellen had come to recognize in the career military officers of Earth. "The evacuation of civilians is nearly complete," she continued, "and only essential personnel and volunteers remain on New Cascadia now." "Good," Admiral Chun said. "Then we can begin." Across the galaxy, intelligence officers from 100 different species monitored the situation with mild curiosity, expecting to witness another routine conquest by a superior power over a weaker one. And they prepared to update their files with a note about how the humans had wisely chosen to flee rather than fight. They were about to learn how terribly wrong they were. The Velthran invasion fleet consisted of 200 warships, including 12 massive dreadnoughts that each carried enough firepower to glass an entire continent. And High Commander Kethser stood on the bridge of his flagship with absolute confidence in his coming victory. "The prey creatures have evacuated most of their population," his sensor officer reported with confusion in his voice. "But they have not withdrawn their military vessels." Kethser's eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display, which showed 47 human warships arranged in a defensive formation around New Cascadia. 47 ships against 200? He laughed again with that grinding sound. "They must be mad or suicidal, or perhaps both. Should we offer them terms of surrender, High Commander?" One of his officers asked. "No," Kethser decided with cruel amusement. "Let them die with whatever honor their primitive species can muster. And let this serve as a lesson to any other minor races who might dream of resisting Velthran supremacy." The Velthran fleet moved into attack formation and prepared to sweep aside the pitiful human defenders with overwhelming force. But as they crossed into weapons range, something unexpected happened. The human ships began to move not in retreat, as Kethser had anticipated, but forward, directly into the heart of the Velthran formation. And they moved with a speed and coordination that made his tactical officers gasp in shock. "They are attacking us?" Kefsar demanded in disbelief before anyone could answer. The first wave of human missiles struck the Velthran fleet, but these were not ordinary missiles. And they did not simply explode on impact. Some of them released clouds of electronic warfare drones that scrambled Velthran sensors and communications, while others detonated with nuclear fire that created expanding spheres of destruction. And still others released swarms of autonomous weapons that sought out enemy ships with cold mechanical hunger. The Velthran fleet, designed for the civilized warfare that the galaxy had practiced for millennia, had no defense against such tactics. "What is this madness?" Kefsar roared as explosions bloomed across his tactical display, and ship after ship went dark as transmission cut through the chaos. And on every Velthran bridge, the face of Admiral James Chun appeared with an expression that contained no anger and no hatred, only an ancient and terrible determination. "You wanted our world," the human said with quiet intensity. "Come and take it." The battle lasted 11 hours when it was over. The Velthran invasion fleet had been reduced to burning wreckage drifting through the void. And of the 200 warships that High Commander Kefsar had led to New Cascadia, only 17 managed to flee into faster-than-light travel. And those 17 would carry tales of horror back to their Admiral Kefsar himself died when human boarding parties cut their way onto his flagship and fought through his elite guards with weapons and tactics that seemed designed to maximize psychological terror as much as physical damage. Not a single human capital ship was destroyed in the engagement, though several were damaged and would require months of repair across the galaxy. Intelligence officers who had been casually monitoring the situation suddenly went very still as they processed what had just happened. And then they began frantically searching through their databases for any information they could find about this species called Homo sapiens. What they found would keep them awake for many nights to come in the council chambers of the Galactic Concord. Counselor Tevan of the Ilisari Collective read the battle reports with growing unease, and he remembered how casually he had dismissed Ambassador Vasquez's plea for justice. He had thought humans were just another minor species, easily conquered and quickly forgotten. But now he understood that he had made a terrible mistake. The galaxy had made a terrible mistake, and humanity was just getting started. 6 months had passed since the destruction of the Velthran invasion fleet, and the Galactic Council had called an emergency session to address what they were now calling the human question. Counselor Tevan of the Ilisari Collective stood at the central podium of the Great Chamber, surrounded by holographic representatives of 347 spacefaring civilizations, and his 4 eyes were heavy with the weight of the information he was about to share. "Fellow counselors," he began with a voice that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. "I have spent the past 6 months conducting a detailed analysis of the battle at New Cascadia, and what I have learned has forced me to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the human species." He activated the holographic display behind him, and the chamber filled with tactical reconstructions of the battle, showing the precise movements of every ship and every weapon deployed. During those 11 terrible hours, the humans did not fight the way we fight, Tevan explained. They did not follow the civilized rules of engagement that have governed galactic warfare for 12,000 years. A murmur of confusion rippled through the chamber, and a representative from the Corthan Federation raised one of his 7 tentacles to speak. "What do you mean?" the Corthan asked. "Surely all sentient species understand the basic principles of proportional response and negotiated surrender." "That is precisely what I believed," Tevan replied with a bitter note in his voice. "Until I studied human history." He changed the display to show a series of images from Earth's past, And the counselors watched in growing horror as scenes of ancient human warfare played out before them. Humans developed warfare independently on their isolated planet. Tavan continued. And they did so without any contact with galactic civilization or knowledge of our rules. The images showed trenches filled with soldiers in primitive protective gear, cities burning under bombardment, mushroom clouds rising over destroyed population centers, and fields scattered with the bodies of those who had fallen in conflicts that served no clear purpose. They invented a concept called total war, Tavan said, which means the complete mobilization of an entire society for the purpose of destroying the enemy's ability and will to continue fighting. But that would mean, the Corthan representative began with dawning understanding. Yes, Tavan interrupted. It means they do not fight. Wars to win battles or gain territory or extract concessions from their opponents. He paused and led. His four eyes sweep across the chamber before delivering the terrible truth. They fight wars to end enemies. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives shouted questions and demanded clarification, and accused Tavan of exaggeration. But he simply waited for the noise to die down before continuing his presentation. Let me show you what the Velthrons faced, he said. And he began playing recordings captured by Velthron sensors during the battle. The counselors watched as human electronic warfare systems blinded enemy ships and turned their own computers against them. And they saw human psychological operations that broadcast terrifying messages designed to break the will of enemy crews before the fighting even began. They witnessed human boarding parties cutting through armored hulls and fighting hand-to-hand in corridors filled with smoke and blood. And they observed human commanders making split-second decisions that sacrificed individual ships to achieve tactical advantages. That would have seemed insane to any galactic military strategist. They deployed something the translator identifies as relativistic kill vehicles. Tavan reported with a voice that had grown hoarse from speaking, which are essentially small objects accelerated to near light speed and aimed at enemy targets. That is, a counselor from the Ven Consortium gasped. That is monstrous. It is effective, Tavan corrected him. And effectiveness is what humans optimize for when they go to war. He showed them one more recording, taken from the bridge of a Velthron cruiser in the final moments before its destruction. And they heard the voice of a human admiral speaking words that would echo through galactic history. You wanted our world, the human said with no emotion in his voice, except cold and absolute determination. Come and take it. But the most frightening thing I discovered, Tavan announced as he deactivated the display, was not their weapons or their tactics. He pulled up historical records from Earth's databases, files that humans had freely shared with the galaxy without any apparent understanding of how disturbing their contents would be to alien observers. Humans fought these kinds of wars against each other, he explained. For 10,000 years, the chamber fell silent as this information sank in. They invented nuclear weapons, Tavan continued, devices capable of destroying entire cities in a single explosion. And then they pointed these weapons at each other and created a doctrine they called mutually assured destruction. They threatened to destroy themselves? A counselor asked in disbelief. They threatened to destroy everything, Tavan replied. And then they kept those weapons and built more of them and developed even more terrible tools of war because they could not bring themselves to trust that their enemies would not do the same. He looked around the chamber at the horrified faces of representatives from hundreds of civilizations. They fought a conflict called World War II, in which 60 million humans died, he said. And less than a century later, they were fighting new wars with new weapons and new tactics that made those previous conflicts look simple by comparison. How did they survive? Someone asked. They almost did not. Tevan answered. Several times. He deactivated all the displays and stood alone at the podium with nothing but his voice and his words to carry the weight of his conclusion. The humans I've studied are not monsters, he said carefully. They are survivors, and they have survived because they learned to be more dangerous than anything that threatened them. What are we supposed to do with this information? A counselor demanded Evan spread his 4 hands in a gesture that indicated helpless uncertainty. I do not know, he admitted. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. He looked directly at the recording devices that would carry his words to every corner of the galaxy. When humans go to war, they do not stop until the war is won or until they themselves are completely destroyed. And based on my analysis of their history and their capabilities, I am forced to conclude that destroying them would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. He took a deep breath before speaking the words that would change galactic politics forever. They do not know how to stop. Counselor Tevan announced to the silent chamber, and if we give them a reason to start, I am not certain any of us will survive to see them finish. The emergency session continued for another 3 days, but no one had any solutions to offer. And the human question remained unanswered as the representatives returned to their homeworlds carrying nightmares about a species that have evolved to treat war as an existential struggle from which there could be no retreat and no surrender in the months that followed. Every major civilization in the galaxy quietly began updating their military doctrines. And the first item on every new strategic assessment was the same simple warning: do not provoke the humans. 18 months after the destruction of the Velthran fleet, the Krethver hegemony decided that they could succeed where the reptilians had failed. And their reasoning seemed sound on the surface. The Krethver were apex predators from a high-gravity world, where only the strongest and most brutal creatures survived. And they stood 8 feet tall with natural armored carapaces that could deflect small arms, fire, and muscles that could crush steel with their bare hands. They had conquered 37 species through ground combat, and they were universally regarded as the finest infantry soldiers in the galaxy. And their military commanders believed that they had identified the flaw in the Velthran strategy. The humans excel at space combat, Supreme Warlord Grathnak explained to his general staff. But no species can be supreme in all forms of warfare. And the Velthrans were fools to challenge them in the void where their technology gave them advantages. He displayed a holographic image of the human colony world called Elysium 4, a garden planet with rolling green hills and peaceful cities that held a population of 3 million settlers. We will bypass their fleets entirely, Grathnak announced, and we will take this world with ground forces. And we will hold their civilians hostage until they agree to withdraw from the Orion spur entirely. His generals clicked their mandibles in approval, and the invasion force was assembled within weeks. Krethver fleet jumped into the Elysium system using unexpected vectors that avoided human sensor networks. And before any significant defense could be organized, 40,000 Krethver warriors had landed on the surface and taken control of the capital city. 200,000 human civilians became prisoners of the hegemony, and Supreme Warlord Grathnak transmitted his demands to Earth with absolute confidence in his leverage. You value individual lives, he declared in his message, and we now hold 200,000 of them. So you will withdraw your presence from this region of space, or we will begin executing hostages at a rate of 1,000 per hour until you comply. The human response was not what he expected. There was no immediate negotiation, no panicked acceptance of terms, no begging for mercy or time. There was only silence. For 3 days the humans said nothing at all. And Grathnak began to wonder if perhaps his communications had been blocked somehow. But then his officers reported something strange. Human military vessels had not retreated from the system, but had instead taken up positions in high orbit. And they were making no aggressive moves, but also showing no signs of withdrawal. Perhaps they are planning a rescue attempt, one of his generals suggested, but that would be suicide. And humans are not stupid enough to attack our fortified positions with infantry. Grafnak was not so certain anymore on the third night of the occupation. Krethver, sentries on the perimeter of the capital city, began disappearing. The first reports seemed like sensor glitches or perhaps local wildlife. But then the bodies started appearing, and they had been killed with surgical precision by weapons and techniques that left no trace of the attackers. What is happening? Grafnak demanded when his casualty reports began climbing. No one could answer him. The humans had deployed special operations, units with names that would later become legendary throughout the galaxy. And these units have been infiltrating the occupation zone since the moment the invasion began. Teams called Ghosts moved through the city like shadows, eliminating sentries and gathering intelligence without leaving any evidence of their presence. Warriors, known as Reapers, struck at supply depots and communication nodes, destroying critical infrastructure with explosives that seemed to appear from nowhere. Soldiers, bearing the insignia of the Black Watch, coordinated with human civilians who had volunteered to resist the occupation, turning every neighborhood into a potential ambush setter. Grafnak had studied galactic military doctrine his entire life, but nothing had prepared him for what the humans called asymmetric warfare. They are not fighting us with armies, his intelligence officer reported with growing fear in his voice. They are fighting us with ghosts and shadows and citizens who look harmless until they strike. Then we will execute hostages as promised, Grafnak decided, and that will force them to reveal themselves. He ordered 1,000 civilians to be gathered in the central plaza for public execution. But before his soldiers could carry out the command, the city went dark. Every power station, every backup generator, every light source in the capital simultaneously failed. And in the absolute darkness that followed, the humans attacked. It was not an army that swept through the Krethfor positions that night, but something far more terrifying. Small teams of human operators moved through the darkness with perfect coordination, their weapons equipped with devices that let them see without light. And they killed with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Grattan received frantic reports from units across the city as his forces were systematically destroyed. But he could not respond effectively because his communications had been jammed and his command structure had been disrupted by precision strikes against his officers. They smile when they fight, a dying soldier transmitted before his signal was cut off. They smile. By dawn the occupation was over, and the Supreme Warlord found himself surrounded in his command bunker by human soldiers who had appeared from ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels in places he had never thought to guard. The human commander was a woman named Colonel Sarah Okonkwo, and she stood before him without any trace of fear, despite being half his size and possessing none of his natural weapons. "Your hostages are safe," she informed him in a voice that was calm and controlled. "Every single one of them." "That is impossible," Grafnak protested. "We held 200,000 prisoners." "You held 200,000 reasons for us to come here," the colonel replied. "And we do not leave our people behind." The battle for Elysium 4 was recorded by Krethfor helmet cameras, and within weeks, those recordings had been leaked to the galactic media, and every civilization with access to the networks could watch the footage of human soldiers moving through darkness like predators hunting prey. They saw the terrifying efficiency of human close-quarters combat, the impossible coordination of units operating without direct communication, and most disturbing of all, they saw the expressions on human faces as they fought. The humans did not look angry or afraid or desperate as other species did in battle. They looked calm and focused, and yes, some of them were smiling, and that image burned itself into the collective consciousness of the galaxy. The Krethfor hegemony formally surrendered to humanity. 6 weeks later, becoming the second major power to be humbled by the species that the galaxy had once dismissed as insignificant. But the true impact of the battle was not military, but psychological, and every intelligence agency in the galaxy added new warnings to their assessments of human capabilities. The humans could not be defeated in space. The humans could not be defeated on the ground. The humans would not abandon their own people under any circumstances, and when humans fought, they brought a level of commitment and capability that made even the most powerful civilizations seem primitive by comparison. The galaxy was beginning to understand that the human question was not a problem that could be solved through force, and some other approach would be required if they wanted to avoid a war that might consume them all. The emergency sessions of the Galactic Council had been ongoing for 2 standard years, and the representatives of 347 civilizations had debated the human question until their voices were hoarse and their patience was exhausted. 3 factions had emerged during these endless discussions, each proposing a different solution to the problem that humanity represented, and none of them could convince the others to accept their approach. The first faction was led by the militant species who believed that the only way to deal with humans was to destroy them before they became too powerful to stop. Admiral Vextil of the Zorani Imperium presented their case with charts and projections and military analyses that he believed proved the necessity of immediate action. Every day we delay gives the humans more time to build their forces, he argued, and if we wait too long, we will find ourselves facing an enemy that cannot be defeated by any combination of powers in this galaxy. He displayed war simulations that his strategists had developed, showing how a coordinated attack by the combined fleets of every major civilization might be able to overwhelm human defenses if launched within the next 5 years. The cost would be high, he admitted. Perhaps trillions of lives lost across dozens of worlds, and the war would likely last several decades. And what is the probability of success? Counselor Tevin asked quietly. Admiral Vexthale hesitated before answering. Our simulations indicate that even with every advantage, there is only a 66% chance of defeating humanity, he confessed. And in the remaining 34% of scenarios, the humans achieve either total victory or mutual destruction of both sides. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed this information, and many of them remembered the footage from Elysium 4 and the smiling faces of human soldiers fighting in the darkness. You are asking us to gamble the entire galaxy on a 66% chance, a representative from the Pallid Consortium observed. And if we lose, we face extinction at the hands of a species that we provoked into war. The second faction proposed a different approach that they called containment. We do not need to destroy the humans, argued Chancellor Neath of the Venn Consortium. We simply need to prevent them from expanding beyond their current territory. She presented plans for a blockade that would surround human space with sensor networks and patrol fleets, preventing any human vessel from traveling beyond the boundaries that would be established by Concord law. Over time, isolated from the rest of the galaxy, the humans will either stagnate or turn their aggression inward against themselves, she predicted. And either outcome serves our interests. But the analysts who had studied human history quickly identified the flaws in this strategy. Humans have a concept called a siege mentality, Counselor Tavan explained, and history shows that when they feel surrounded and threatened, they do not weaken but instead become more unified and more determined. He displayed records of human nations that had endured blockades and sanctions and isolation, only to emerge stronger and more dangerous than before. If we attempt to contain them, they will spend the next century building their military forces and developing new weapons and strategies, he warned. And when they eventually break through our containment, they will be angrier and more powerful than they are today. The third faction, led by the Illusari Collective, proposed the most radical solution of all. We cannot defeat the humans through force, and we cannot contain them through isolation, Tevan argued. So we must try something that has never been attempted with a species of their capabilities. He presented a proposal called the Integration Protocol, which would make humanity so essential to galactic civilization, the war with them would become unthinkable. Humans possess qualities that are rare in the galaxy, he explained. They are creative and adaptable, and driven to achieve in ways that other species are not. And many of our civilizations have already discovered that human workers and traders and innovators bring tremendous value to their economies. The economic data supported his argument, showing that human goods and services had become increasingly popular across hundreds of worlds, and that human engineers and designers were solving problems that had baffled alien experts for centuries. If we make them part of our civilization instead of treating them as outsiders, Tevan proposed, they will have no reason to fight us and every reason to cooperate with us. The debates continued for months, with each faction arguing passionately for their position, until finally an aged ambassador from a species called the Thanathi requested permission to address the council ambassador. Caliph was ancient even by the standards of his long-lived species, and he moved slowly to the central podium with the help of mechanical supports that compensated for his failing body. I have lived for 900 years, he began in a voice that was weak but steady. And I remember when my species was nearly destroyed in a war that we started with the wrong enemy. The chamber grew quiet as representatives realized that they were hearing from someone who had witnessed history that most of them knew only from records. We believed that we could defeat them if we struck first. Caliph continued, and we believed that our superior technology and numbers would guarantee our victory. But we were wrong. He paused to gather his strength before continuing. The war lasted 400 years and cost us 90% of our population. And when it was finally over, we had learned a lesson that I see this council struggling to understand. He looked around the chamber with eyes that had seen more conflict than any other being present. You are asking the wrong question, he declared. You ask how to stop humans from fighting, but that is impossible because fighting is what they do when they feel threatened. He raised one trembling hand to point at the assembled representatives. The question you should be asking is this: how do we ensure that humans never have a reason to fight us? The chamber erupted in discussion. But Tellus' words had shifted something in the minds of many representatives, and over the following weeks, a new consensus began to emerge. The result was a document called the Terran Accords, and its terms were unlike anything the galaxy had ever produced. Humanity would be granted full council, membership with voting rights equal to the oldest civilizations, and they would receive expanded territories that recognized their claim to systems they had already settled trade. Agreements would be established that gave humans access to galactic markets on favorable terms, and cultural exchanges would be encouraged to build understanding between humanity and other species. But the most remarkable part of the Terran Accords was what humanity was not required to do. There were no restrictions on human military development, no limits on their expansion, no demands that they change their ways or abandon their warrior traditions. Instead, the restrictions were placed entirely on everyone else. Article 7 of the Terran Accords was the most important section, and it stated in clear and absolute terms the new reality of galactic politics. No member species shall initiate armed conflict with the human race or its designated allies under any circumstances, the article declared, and violations shall result in immediate expulsion from the Galactic Concord and forfeiture of all military protections. In other words, the galaxy had decided that the safest way to deal with humanity was to simply never give them a reason to Fight the Terran Accords were ratified by 312 of the 347 member species, and the civilizations that refused to sign quickly found themselves isolated and pressured by their neighbors until they eventually accepted the New Order ambassador Yelena Vasquez, the same woman who had pleaded for justice before the Council at the beginning of this crisis, signed the Accords on behalf of humanity with the expression that mixed satisfaction with something deeper and harder to read. "We accept these terms," she said simply, "and we hope that this marks the beginning of a new era of peace and cooperation between humanity and the galaxy." What she did not say, and what every representative in the chamber understood without words, was that humanity had achieved through strength what they could never have achieved through diplomacy alone. The galaxy had not chosen peace because it was the right thing to do. The galaxy had chosen peace because it was afraid of what would happen if it chose war. 50 years had passed since the signing of the Terran Accords, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted during those desperate emergency sessions of the Galactic Council. Counselor Ninth of the Ilisari Collective was a young historian by the standards of her long-lived species, barely 300 years old, and she had dedicated her career to understanding the human phenomenon that had reshaped galactic civilization today. She was visiting a small house on a cliff overlooking an ocean on the human homeworld called Earth, where a 94-year-old man named James Chun spent his retirement watching the waves and tending to a garden of flowers that his late wife had planted decades ago. Admiral Chun had commanded the fleet that destroyed the Velthran invasion force at New Cascadia, and he had later served as the Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Force during the critical years following the Terran Accords. And now he was simply an old man who enjoyed the peace that he had helped to create. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Ninth said as she settled into a chair beside him on the terrace, her four eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight that reflected off the water below. "I do not receive many visitors these days," Admiral Chun replied with a smile that softened the weathered lines of his face. "And I am always curious to learn what the galaxy thinks of us after all these years." Ninth activated her recording device and prepared to ask the questions that had been debated by scholars and politicians and ordinary citizens across hundreds of worlds. "The galaxy has changed dramatically since the Terran Accords," she began, "and humans now serve as peacekeepers and mediators throughout Concord space. And your mere presence on disputed borders is often enough to prevent conflicts from escalating." "I am aware of this," the Admiral nodded, "and I have mixed feelings about it." "Mixed feelings?" Ninth asked with surprise. "Your species has achieved a position of influence that would have seemed impossible 50 years ago, and the peace that you have helped to maintain has saved countless lives." Admiral Chun turned to look at her with eyes that had witnessed things she could only read about in historical records. "When I was a young man," he said slowly, "I dreamed of a universe where humans could live without fear of attack, where we could explore and build and create without constantly preparing for the next war." He gestured toward the peaceful garden and the endless blue horizon beyond it. "Now we have that universe, but we achieved it by making everyone else afraid of us. And sometimes I wonder if that is truly a victory or simply a different kind of defeat." Ninth considered his words carefully before asking the question that had motivated her entire research project. "Admiral Chun, the galaxy has wondered about this for 5 decades, and I would be honored if you would give me an honest answer." She leaned forward with all 4 of her eyes focused intently on his face. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The fighting?" The Admiral was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that spanned nearly a century of human history. "Let me tell you something that most aliens never understood about humanity. He began. "We are not a species that loves war, but your history," Ninth protested. "The endless conflicts, the weapons of mass destruction, the doctrines of total war." "Yes," Admiral Chun interrupted gently. "All of that is true, and it is the reason why the galaxy learned to fear us. But it is not the complete picture." He rose from his chair and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking out at the ocean that had existed long before humans evolved, and would exist long after they were gone. Every human carries the inherited trauma of 10,000 years of conflict, he explained. And we remember the trenches where our great-grandfathers died for strips of mud. And we remember the cities that were burned, and the families that were torn apart, and the civilizations that were destroyed. He turned back to face Ninth with an expression that contained something she had never seen in a human before. A deep and ancient sadness that seemed to connect to every generation of his species that had ever lived. We became terrifyingly good at war because for our entire existence. The alternative was extinction, he continued. Every tribe, every nation, every alliance that failed to master violence was conquered or absorbed or eliminated by those who were better at killing. But that created a species of warriors, Ninth pointed out. Beings who were forged by conflict into the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. It created a species of survivors. Admiral Chun corrected her firmly. There is a difference. He sat back down in his chair and looked at his garden, at the flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names in any alien language. The warrior seeks battle because fighting gives their life meaning, he said. But the survivor fights only because they must. And they dream always of the day when fighting will no longer be necessary. Ninth felt something shift in her understanding of humanity, a perspective that none of her research had ever suggested. You are saying that humans never wanted to be what they became? She asked. We wanted to live, Admiral Chun replied simply. We wanted our children to grow up in safety and our elders to die in peace. And we wanted to build things that would outlast us and explore the universe that seemed so vast and full of wonders. He smiled. And for the first time, Ninth understood that it was not a predator's smile. But every time we reached for those dreams, something tried to destroy us, he continued. Nature, disease, other humans, and eventually the galaxy itself. And so we learned to fight because the universe gave us no other choice. And now? Ninth asked. Now we have something we never had before, Admiral Chun said with a tone that was almost wondering. We have a universe where we do not have to fight, where our children can grow up without learning to kill, where our scientists can study stars instead of designing weapons. He laughed softly at some private thought. The Galactic Council did not stop humans from fighting wars, he observed. They gave humanity something far more valuable than that. What did they give you? Ninth asked. A reason to stop, the Admiral replied. For the first time in our entire history, survival does not require us to be warriors. And we are finally free to become something else. Ninth deactivated her recording device and sat in silence with the old man, watching the sun descend toward the ocean as the sky turned colors that existed only on this small blue world that had produced the most feared species in galactic history. What will you become? She asked finally, not as a historian but as someone who genuinely wanted to know. Admiral Chun considered the question as the light faded and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. I do not know, he admitted. Humanity has never had the opportunity to find out. But I hope I live long enough to see the beginning of the answer. He smiled at her one last time, and his eyes reflected the starlight like windows into a future that was finally full of possibility instead of threat. We never wanted to be warriors. Counselor, he said with a voice that contained all the hope and sorrow of his entire species. We just wanted to survive long enough to become something else. He looked up at the stars that his people were now free to explore without fear. And now, Thanks to laws written out of fear of us, we finally can, Ninth returned to her homeworld and wrote a book about humanity that became required reading in universities across the galaxy. And the title she chose captured the truth that Admiral Chun had shared with her on that terrace overlooking an alien ocean. The Reluctant Warriors. How fear gave humanity peace. And in the decades that followed, as humans spread across the galaxy as teachers and builders and explorers instead of soldiers and conquerors, the fear that had created the Terran Accords slowly transformed into something else entirely. It became respect, and then admiration, and finally, for some species, something very close to love. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity because of what they could do. But in the end, the galaxy learned to appreciate humanity because of what they chose not to do. That, more than any battle or treaty or law, was the true measure of what the human species had always been capable of becoming.